Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Byteworks panel discussion on the topic of 5 cybersecurity beliefs that are guaranteed to get you fired. I'm your host, Adam Kingery, Solutions Advisor with Byteworks. If you're joining us today from Facebook Live or YouTube, please feel free to ask questions, submit comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you find this valuable. So what are these 5 cybersecurity beliefs that are guaranteed to get you fired? We'll get to that in a minute. Joining me today is our expert panel of guests. We've got James Willard.
Hi, I'm James Willard with Byteworks. For those of you who don't know, Byteworks is a information technology services company where we focus on data center, which includes the storage, compute, virtualization stack, as well as cloud, enterprise networking, collaborations, voice, video, and web conferencing, as well as, of course, cybersecurity.
We've got James Schuman.
James Schuman. I'm the security solutions architect for Byteworks. Been doing security for over 20 years, pretty much half of that on the Department of Defense side and the other half on the commercial. So a lot of different environments I've been working on, and that's kind of what keeps it interesting for me.
Excellent. We've got Kieran Foley.
Hey everybody, I'm Kieran Foley. I've been a serial entrepreneur for about 30 years now, so that dates me well. Started one of the first web application development firms in the world back in the early 90s, and also one of the first social communities around corporate and personal security education. Today I'm joining you with Xenex. We're a Los Angeles-based firm delivering a fully managed security operations as a service in the cloud.
Very good. And last but not least, Kevin Niku.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kevin Niku. I'm founder and CEO of Xenex. I have started and sold 3 other companies, but I'm mostly excited about Xenex because it really addresses a big need in the industry and in the market in general. We have recognized how important it is to help our customers find solutions that makes it more secure, and I'm very excited to be here and glad to share some of those insights with you.
Thank you, gentlemen. So without further ado, let's dig into these 5 cybersecurity beliefs that are guaranteed to get you fired. Belief number 1, don't worry, I've got firewalls and antivirus. So if I have a next generation firewall and I'm running advanced security services, like on a Cisco PIX, for example, or I'm running Windows Defender on my desktops and laptops, isn't that really enough? Let's start with you, James Schuman.
Traditionally, firewalls, antivirus has kind of been the workhorse for most, companies or organizations, security portfolio, let's say. And these products have really evolved, especially over the last 5 or 6 years. Firewalls, we have, malware detection running on them. We got content filtering. It's just a lot of, different security devices that used to be separate are now all together in a single box, which really increases the protection, capabilities of those devices. The problem is while those devices have been evolving, so has companies' business requirements and just the way of the world, right? So we have a lot of organizations using cloud-based applications, cloud storage. A lot of people are using mobile devices, and while that's been going on, also users, their expectations have also evolved. They expect to be able to get to any data, any applications, any systems from anywhere. They could be sitting on a bus and get to those important business solutions. So we have to take a look at that and be like, okay, well, what are these new threat vectors? And most of them are not bypassing the firewall. They're not traversing the firewall. So the firewall doesn't have visibility into those new vectors. And so we have to look at other products to basically come in and fill those gaps, right? So say a CASB type system for being able to monitor and provide policies for cloud-based applications. Know who's logging in, where they're logging in from, what can they do when they log in, things like that. Cloud storage is especially a big one. If you have SharePoint, online SharePoint, or Dropbox where you're keeping really important data, you need to make sure that that data isn't being accessed by unauthorized users. And so we have to look at these other products now and make sure that we're filling those gaps.
Excellent. Kevin, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think traditionally people were looking at security as a perimeter defense is enough, and that's where firewalls came from. But it's a known fact right now that most attacks are coming from insider threats, mostly because now we've got a cloud proliferation everywhere, so the applications are no longer within the organization, and there's connectivity to many outside applications, and that allows the uneducated or unsophisticated users to click on browsers or open an attachment that introduces a threat cell into the environment, and then those threat cells actually duplicate themselves across the entire environment. As a result, the insider threat is much bigger than what it used to be, the perimeter defense from firewall. So it's not at all the issue about firewalls, and that's a necessary component, but it's definitely a small component of the entire security posture, which is now completely different what it used to be.
Very good. Kieran.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I mean, all great points. The only thing I could add to that is that if you look again at that sort of micro environment or macro environment that we're in, we've got social and political climates where really, even everybody from bad actors to nation states are waging war against each other online. And so absolutely, most of these threats are coming from the inside. And what we've seen recently is the advance of advanced persistent threats, which exist within a network from between, say, 71 and 204 days without ever being detected. And certainly these could be being brought in by bad actors, even hires at larger companies. But they're also coming in through common tools. If you consider the web browser that you use today, it's very different than the one we've been using a half decade ago. It is a fully, very, very powerful platform in its own right, and can really carry payloads. And with one wrong click, you can introduce those APDs or advanced persistent threats into the network very easily. So, I look at it humorously a little bit like everybody inside your organization running around with scissors. If they have access to a browser, they can do great harm.
Wow, that provides some really great insight. And it sounds like, we're in a different place than we were a decade ago, right? And most of the threats, rather than coming from the outside or other countries, they're coming from the inside, from our own people making mistakes and clicking on things that they shouldn't click on. So there's definitely a user education aspect of this that also comes into play. It also sounds like some of the things that we need to be doing are also keeping eyes on those different security vectors. I think everybody's got a million things that they've got to do every day. And if you're not keeping an eye on these threats, where they're coming from in these different vectors, you could get surprised and things could spread, to your point, Kieran, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, to your point about training, I think there was a recent study which did an examination of training, and we're talking about sophisticated users as well as people who are maybe naive about what they're doing, how they're behaving online. And even among sophisticated users that are well trained inside an organization, it was found that you got to retrain roughly every 4 to 6 months for that information to stick, and also to make sure that you're retraining to counter what's happening today. In fact, I just got a notice yesterday, and I'm not making this up, I swear, from a bank that I use, basically saying that I click on this link because they've closed one of my accounts or whatever. It happens all the time.
These threatening sources are getting a lot better at faking things, spoofing things, making them look completely legitimate.
Yeah, it used to be, quantity over quality, because you could, all the misspellings, people make fun of it all the time. Hey, if you can't understand it, it's pretty much, a phishing attack. But nowadays, it's really about quality now, and it's, they're doing research. They're finding out who's your financial person, who's actually sending out the checks. Let's find out what banks you guys use. Let's actually try to, actually impersonate those banks to your financial people. They're getting very, very good at this new game, just because the old game's not working anymore. So
yeah, and they're using AI. They're using AI to collect that information and correlate it so that they have a much better understanding of the target audience that they're going after.
That's right. And with attacks also, we're looking at differences in terms of delivery of these attacks. For instance, in the past, we were able to potentially identify very large networks of cyber criminals who might be instantiating these attacks by means of shutting down domains. But recently, with some high-profile attacks, we've seen the advent of blockchain-based DNS or domain name systems that allow basically not only obfuscation, but it becomes practically impossible to shut down the operations of these bots and other mechanisms to actually try to trick you. So the environment is getting certainly more complex and more dangerous every day.
Very scary. Let's move on to belief number 2. So don't worry about end users and remote users. They'll only impact their home networks. So what are the potential threats for not only my remote users, but the damage that they can do to a business? Let's start with you, Kevin.
Well, I can put it in a story. It's a real story that we dealt with. Most users, even if they're, they have no bad intentions, could be compromising the entire environment. This example was a parent who took his notebook home, and the kids actually took it and not knowing what they were doing. They were playing around games, and they went to the network, downloaded stuff, and the parent didn't know, plugged into the corporate network. Lo and behold, there was already a threat cell sitting on that notebook, went through VPN very clearly, connected to the entire network, and from there on, the hackers got in, the bad actors got in and started compromising the entire network. So it's very easy when you're a remote user and unknowingly to make a mistake or have somebody else who has access to your device, whether it's a USB that they connect to your remote device, typically a notebook, an iPad or something, or actually downloading something that they're not supposed to. And that's the beginning of a big compromise inside the corporate environment.
So am I to understand that kids don't have to follow an acceptable use policy of their parents' company?
I don't think it works that way.
Not when it comes to playing Fortnite, that's for sure.
That's right.
Kieran, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, again, the future of a lot of work is remote. A lot of it is going to be from home, and so it has to be taken very seriously. If home usage is being perhaps even more perilous than in the service of work at work, and the reasons are numerous, but among them, you're also sitting on a network that itself could be compromised. We're looking at the advent of IoT devices in our houses, lights and switches and goodness knows what else. Each of those today, knowing the situation we have with IoT and how poorly standardized it is and how poor the security is, any one of those devices can become a vector to introduce issues into the home network and thereby potentially infect the machine that I'm then connected to work assets with. And so that becomes a real challenge. You're not able to control the environment as much as you would, say, for instance, at work.
So we need to get rid of smart thermostats, Ring cameras, smart lighting, all of that stuff, because it's just going to introduce more vectors for people to come in and threaten us.
I think we're past that stage now. We've got them. They're there to stay. But certainly we have to become wiser about how to say, for instance, keep those devices on a separate network from the one we're accessing work resources to. And that's even above and beyond, use of a VPN and other tools like that.
Gotcha. James Schumann, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that I've seen is a lot of social engineering attacks now are kind of, more focusing on these work from home environments. So like we had a customer where they got a call and it was their IT department asking them to, basically set up VNC or basically allow them to remote into their machine. And then the way that company's VPN was set up, they had it set up where only interesting traffic was going into the corporate network. Everything else was being dropped off on the local ISP. So if they were going to google.com, they were just going dropped on the local internet. So that the attacker was able to actually go out, download a bunch of stuff on that machine local because there was no protection there, no outbound firewall, nothing, no IPS, nothing like that. And then they were able to run those tools and those applications and attack, further into the network. So basically using it as a pivot point. So I think one of the big things that we need to start looking at is taking some of these services that are sitting on the firewall today and pulling them down to the endpoint. So things like DNS security, a lot of these DNS security products, so like Umbrella and Zscaler and stuff, are actually using cloud-based firewalls that you can actually set up, so you can actually block, outbound SMTP from an individual machine, no matter where they're at. So we need to start looking at pulling some of the stuff in. I'm not saying get rid of your firewall or anything like crazy like that, but we need to see what makes sense to pull down and do it at the endpoint, because that is, as we start doing more remote access and stuff like that, that is kind of our final line of defense. And in some cases, it's our only line of defense. And so we really need to kind of concentrate on that.
So it sounds like what I'm hearing there is, it's not good enough to have a firewall or just antivirus if you're working remotely. You need multiple points where you can have visibility and protect yourself from these threat actors and bad things out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, security is never about one particular solution. It's layers of security that have to go on top of each other. And even at that, there is no guarantee that the hackers don't get in there, get more sophisticated, and they're going to find ways to cut through these layers of security and to get in. So there is, there's endpoint protection, there's network protection, there is antivirus, and a lot of other tools, but they all have to work in coordinated effort to stop the hackers.
So I appreciate you bringing that up, Kevin, because I think that plays right into our next belief that'll get you fired. And I think that is, don't worry about security policies. There are bigger issues to deal with. I think a lot of people think, we have all these tools and we've deployed them and they're just going to work, right? What is the importance of security policies? Huron, maybe you can take this one.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at most security is a process. It's not a technology. It's not necessarily a device or a piece of software that's delivered. It is a process. And so in that way, when we look at security as a whole, as a process, people are at the center of it everywhere. And it doesn't matter where you are, those people's behaviors are going to affect things. And the only way to establish sort of standards for behavior and also understanding and education, but then also equally importantly, testing around that, making sure that people are adhering to that and understand why they're adhering to it, is really the function of having good policies that are clear. And I would add to that the tendency sometimes in business is to write policies that sound great from a business perspective, but if the user can't understand them and they're not clear, let's face it, people don't like reading a lot of text today. So my advice on that front would be, establish policies that are clear, direct, and most importantly, easy to understand and easy to read, and then test against those.
That's a really fantastic point, because most acceptable use policies look like legal documentation to me.
Yeah.
James Schuman, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I always look at policies as like extra security controls, right? So, you have security controls. It could be, an ACL on a firewall is a technical security control, but a policy can also be set up that way. And they can also be used to help with budgeting constraints and things like that. So, for example, if you have a lot of laptops in your environment, the most traditional way is to kind of get MDM set up and running. So that way, if a laptop gets stolen or whatever, we can, remote wipe it, make sure that the data on there doesn't get out there in the open, right? Well, you can also look at from a point of view and saying, hey, let's write a policy. Let's say that, all laptops that we provision for the internal have hard drive encryption turned on. And that kind of meets the same kind of requirement without having to worry about the implementation of MDM, the cost of MDM and stuff. I still think MDM is great. I'm just saying if your budget can't allow you to actually go with an MDM product, sometimes you can look at policies to kind of help you through those areas until you do get the budget to actually implement maybe some stronger security controls. But you look at them as a tool and something that can be used to help guide that security journey to make sure you get to where you need to be, even though you can't get all the way there today.
And James, your comment brings up a good point, which is, the difference between what is sort of a consumer-facing or a client-facing, or in this case, employee-facing policy that the rest of the world knows about, and then true security policies from a an instantiation perspective, from a security system perspective. And I think both are extremely important, obviously necessary.
Yeah, agree, 100%.
Yeah, excellent. Kevin, your thoughts?
So I think security policies are a critical part of the process, and I look at it as more of an education, and I split it into end user policies for the end user and policies for IT. IT, for example, MDM and encryption; those are kind of policies that IT has to adhere with. But when you look at the end user policy, it's more of a policy / education. How to use your USB devices. Can you use your USB devices? When you log in, how do you log in? You must use VPN to get into a network. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff. And there's tools to actually educate. Don't click on things that you don't know. Don't download stuff that you don't know. Contact your IT department if you don't know something. So these are very simple, but in practice, they're actually very difficult to monitor. But there are tools that you can put in place that catch the user and say, hey, listen, you didn't do this. Here's a practice for you to learn from. And it automates that process. So I consider the policy to be more of a education / enforcement using automation, so the policy has meaningful impact to the enterprise.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great point. So you even have policies that cross both, right? They go on the IT and they can be named the same. So incident response is one that sticks out to me, right? You have, what the user does when they see something that's not right. They download something, they see something not working, see a weird person walking in the office, just something like that. And then you also have the instant response from the IT administration side, or the IT group side, that, hey, here's all of our, roles and responsibilities. Here's how we're going to make this an efficient process so we can get through and scope things right and everything. So it's really important to look at both sides of it. I agree 100%.
I think what makes this interesting too is, back to the conversation about working from home and remote users, is, a policy and what should I do now, especially in the case of, say, an emergency or something that appears to be an emergency. When you're in an office environment, you can turn to your coworkers and ask them in the moment and say, what do we do about this again, and how should we address this? But imagine now you've got a lot of workers basically isolated at home. You want to make sure that when they're confronted with a situation that's foreign to them, or that may pose, in fact, a grave threat to the network based upon what they're doing, that they really know how to address that, and while recognizing that they don't have others to turn to instantly around them.
That's a really fantastic point, Kieran, which I think kind of moves into our next belief number 4. Don't hinder end users by implementing security controls. And I think we all can kind of, maybe not you guys, I can certainly understand where this is coming from, right? Security can get to the point where it becomes a hindrance for me actually being able to operate and do my job and interact with other folks inside of our organization, interact with customers. It can be a bit much sometimes. What are your guys' thoughts around this? Let's start with James Schumann.
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple things that I always kind of talk about when we're talking about implementation of these controls and stuff. The first thing is you got to always have senior management backup, right? So especially when you're talking about large security controls, let's say 802.1x wired authentication, that can always cause a little bit of headache during the implementation process, just because there's always devices on the network that you don't know about, and that will end up getting knocked off or possibly knocked off. And so, having that buy-off by management saying this is important to the business, and here's why. And I think that's another thing that gets glossed over a lot is you got to make sure end users kind of understand why we're implementing this. What's the actual issue and why are we doing this? I mean, you don't need to get in technical, but you can just, very high level, hey, we're seeing, unauthorized devices being plugged in the network, so we're trying to, resolve that, and so we're gonna implement this. And then the last thing is successful implementation. I've seen it many times in my career that, an implementation goes south, and then after that point, anytime there's even a little hiccup, the end users are saying, well, it's that security product, that's the problem, even if it had nothing to do with that security product. So I think those are the 3 big things that I always look for whenever I'm having this conversation with customers.
So I think my takeaway from that is end user communication, right? I think companies a lot of times will put security controls in place and they won't do a good job letting their end users know what's happening. So when they have problems, the first thing is they pick up the phone or they type in an email, open up a ticket with the help desk, right? And you guys don't want that. We don't want that. It just makes things much more difficult. Kieran, what are your thoughts around this?
Yeah, it's interesting because there are multiple dimensions to this. One of them is an issue of control versus security versus convenience. And so as you look at those axes, they're in competition with each other. I think back to kind of a funny story. It was funny back then. Now I look back and think that, it was frightening what I did. But as a young consultant, I was working with a company. It was a Fortune company, and they'd instituted controls that were so locked down so as to prevent me from doing my job within the walls of the organization. And I'll get into that detail in a second. But that to say that security personnel, we really need to also understand what's being done. What is that job? What do they require? What does the end user require? Because as you look at the various functions within an organization, marketing may have very different requirements than sales, and certainly than engineering, R&D, and others. And so the security requirements may be different across those functions. In my case, I admit to, and caveat, I would not do this again, but I admit to having brought my own machine. And when it failed and they detected me on their network, I brought my own hotspot and ended up working with my own machine, my own hotspot from that office, coming in through the public network and doing my work on my own machine. It was the only way that I could get stuff done. And you obviously don't want this to happen. This was a long time ago, but this is the type of situation you want to avoid. I'm also a big believer from the entrepreneurial side. We're looking at a lot more tools today that provide power in the user's hands to be able to do self-admin, to be able to get to resources, say, through the web versus other means. And I think all of that needs to be looked at carefully because at the end of the day, you want your employees to be productive and not start rebelling against what you have in place. And at the same time, you want your network secure and your resources secure.
So my key takeaway from that is really, I think organizations need to do a better job on the front end when considering different security controls, taking a look at the different groups within their organization to figure out what their needs are so that when they implement those security controls, it doesn't get in the way of them doing their job. And again, back to communication, accurately communicating what you're doing so that everybody knows what's going on and what steps to take when they have issues. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think end user communication is critical, but we've come a long way from the time that we had to do manual work, kind of say. There are a lot of tools these days, AI tools, browser isolation technology, for example, that takes that end user browser, excuse me, and moves it to a virtual session in the cloud so that the environment is never touched by a hacker. So these types of zero trust environments allow the users to continue working the way they do without an impact on that end user, even if there's threat actors in the environment, because AI will pick it up, or it's isolated in an environment that does not impact the user. So that's why I'm saying we've come a long way. It used to be, hey, look at the manual implementation of something and look at it manually. And we've come all the way to the point that now there are tools available that behind the scenes, they do the heavy lifting and they allow the users to continue working while these tools are looking for anomalous behavior, bad actors, communication to the outside world that should not happen. And even, you turn on a notebook and you bring it into the in the network and it says, hey, I don't understand who this is. By the way, it's got something wrong with it. So it's anomalous behavior by the user or by the devices, and it's all done behind the scenes. So it reduces the impact on the end user. So I think we've come a long way. And the answer is, yes, we're not hindering users as much as we used to.
Very good. So I feel like that was a great segue into our last belief, the final one that'll get you fired, which is don't worry about being compromised. We have a plethora of security products that are already in place and taking care of us. So what I'd like each of you guys to do in this one is kind of give us what can you do to help us, right? So maybe we'll start with Kevin and then Kieran about what Zenix can do for you to help you put all this together. And then James, I would like you to kind of follow them up by saying, what can Byteworks do to help you with this plethora of security products that we've got in place? So Kieran, maybe you can start.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think it's interesting when we look at security, again, talking about security products, whether they be hardware or software, is a mistake to equate having those, creating signals, even bringing that all into a single dashboard or a single pane of glass, as it's known in the industry, and being looked at live 24/7. Just having that is not enough today. And the reason for that is when you consider the amount of potential threat that your network is being hit with every day. I was just writing an article where a number of honeypots or sort of attractive servers were set up to test the notion of attack. And within this situation, having put up one of these servers, it was attacked within 30 seconds. And over the next month, there were over 1 million attempted compromises of that system. So imagine now, multiply that by the number of devices in a network and the number of employees you have, and now you've got home working and you've got work in the office. It's unimaginable what's happening out there. It is a war. And so bringing that back, a number of years ago, it might have been enough to have a firewall. And then it might have been enough to have a number of devices, endpoint devices, that you yourself, put to work in your network. And then it might have been enough to take each of the individual signals from those devices and software products and bring them into a single pane of glass. But we're way beyond that now. Where we're at now is we need technology's assistance in understanding this barrage of constant information being generated by attacks. And so at Zenix, we have what's called the Zenix XDR. It is a massive correlation engine, which basically sits at the heart of what we offer to our clients. And what we offer to our clients is not only the technology, but also the people assistance, which is equally important, so that they can basically reduce their stress level, increase their security. But what this correlation engine does is it takes what would have been disparate, siloed signals, albeit coming together in a single pane of glass. Guess who has to do the correlation in that case, right? Overworked CISOs and their staffs. Well, in this case, what you do is put something smart in between that barrage of signals, in our case, 700 plus and growing, and allow the system to do some interpretation so that you can take some of that off the plate of the human workers. That's where we're at today. And if you're not using a solution of some sort that does massive correlation and uses some form of AI, frankly, you're running in the dark.
Thank you for that. Kevin, any additions to that?
Yeah, I think I'm going to add on. Kieran explained it really well. I've been in the industry for over 35 years, and 30 of it has been in security. And I have seen from the early firewalls. In fact, I deployed one of the first Cisco devices that came out long time ago, more years than I want to admit. But these devices, when they came in, you just plugged it in and they did their own thing. And over time, there's one tool after another tool after another tool. Before you know it, and typically right now you talk to a customer and they have 20, 30 tools. And they're generating information, signals. But you ask them, well, what does that mean? First of all, they don't monitor it. They don't know what those signals mean. Secondly, they don't have an enterprise view, an umbrella of security across the entire enterprise to interpret the data that's being collected. And I think that's what we are very good at. We know that it is impossible to take this information and treat them in isolation. It doesn't give you the necessary information. But if you collect it from firewalls, routers, applications, you name it, cloud applications, even AWS, Google, and Azure, collect all of that information, bring it together, and do the cross correlation that Kieran talked about. All of a sudden, you get visibility to the entire environment, and you have a sense of what's going on in the entire environment. And with AI and some of the zero trust tools built into this environment, that we offer, then all of a sudden you reduce a pretty significant amount of that risk out, and a much better visibility for the customer.
And actually, one more point to make on that, which I think is important generically speaking across the board, and that is, in the past, security engineering would consider analysis of logs, these signals that are recorded after the fact, after something has happened, to be something that you would correlate and look at and look back at. That's great for forensics, but it's not necessarily giving you a view into the enterprise as it's operating behaviorally right this instant. And so one thing I would advise any organization to do is begin to move past this sort of log-centric view, which to my, this is a rather crude example, but to my mind, it's more like a post-mortem on the organization than actually taking the vital signs inside that organization, inside that living entity, and instead look at a system that can correlate information live behaviorally, even before it hits logs, as it's trafficking. And you'll find that, for instance, behaviors that affect performance may indeed be signals that you need to pay attention to when it comes to security. So that's an extra thought on that level.
Thank you, Kieran. And finally, James, what can Byteworks do to help keep our customers and prospects from being compromised and help them organize all of these different security products that they've got?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I have is having a reasonable approach to security. We kind of alluded it on the last question. Kieran was, having that that balance there and saying, okay, well, we need to understand the business objectives first. Okay, for all the different departments, figure out what's going on. And then we can look at the security tools that you currently have in place and say, okay, well, here's where we can get better. Here's what we can do. We can, implement best practices. Because as you add more and more security control or security products, IT staffs get a little overwhelmed. They can't be an expert on every single security product out there because there's millions of them. Let's be honest. Every 2 weeks, I'm seeing 600,000 more products out on the market or some crazy thing.
Yeah.
And so, that's where we can come in and help with, trying to make sure that, everything is being done as you think it is. So, you'd be like, well, my firewall is pretty secure. Okay, well, let's take a look at it. Let's do an assessment. Let's review the configuration. Let's see where we can be better at, or if we can be better. Hopefully not. Hopefully everything's great. But usually we can find some ways to either optimize things, make things more secure, make more visibility. That's another thing. I mean, we're talking about logs and stuff, but if the device isn't configured correctly to actually pick up that visibility for those logs, then you're not going to see anything in the logs. So, just making sure that everything is configured correctly, optimized to run, the most efficient way possible, and then optimized for the business, making sure we're meeting business objectives, we're protecting, critical assets. And if we don't have the budget to, do the uncritical stuff, we can, monitor that stuff in different ways, policies, other things that we can do there to try to mitigate, maybe not remediate the threats there. But yeah, I think that's the biggest thing.
So if I'm hearing you all properly, it sounds like cybersecurity isn't just a set it and forget it. It's something that you need to take a look at regularly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, yearly, at the very least, right? And then evaluating where you're at, constantly doing gap analysis, evaluating the different products and things and how they can benefit your organization, finding the right partners to help give you third-party perspective, and also keep an eye on things real time to hopefully catch some of these threats before they become a real issue to your organization. So I want to thank my panelists today. Thank you, Kieran. Thank you, James. Thank you, Kevin. And in closing, I hope you aren't doing any of these 5 things that will guaranteed get you fired. But if you are, please contact us before it's too late. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. I'm Adam Kingery, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.